Miami didn't just cost Ferrari a podium, it exposed something they can't fix with an upgrade. Lewis Hamilton's radio message went viral instantly. But the frustration wasn't the story. What caused it was, Ferrari had the pace, they had the window, and they still waited while the opportunity disappeared lap by lap. Hamilton saw it in real time. The pit wall didn't react, and when they finally moved, it was already too late. This isn't about one bad call. This goes much deeper than Miami. Before we get into it, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every single one, and stay until the end because we'll open the discussion about everything that happened. The first thing you need to understand about Miami is this: Ferrari didn't show up slow. That's what makes everything that followed so much harder to explain. For most of the season, the narrative around Ferrari had been simple. The car wasn't fast enough. The pace wasn't there. The gaps at the front were too big to fight back, and for weeks that explanation was enough. It justified the results. It gave the team a clear target: build a faster car, solve the aero problems, close the gap. But Miami changed the framing entirely, because in Miami Ferrari was fast, not just competitive, not just close. Fast enough to fight for the podium in real conditions, against real pressure, in a race that was still completely open, and they still came away with nothing. That's the part that doesn't add up. That's the part that stayed in the air, long after the checkered flag. And that's exactly why, when Lewis Hamilton's radio message started spreading everywhere, people felt something beyond just frustration. They felt like they'd seen something real, something that wasn't supposed to be visible. Let's go back to the beginning of the Miami Grand Prix. Because to understand what happened, you need to understand what Ferrari thought they were walking into. The upgrades they brought to Miami were real, not cosmetic, not symbolic. The team had been working on specific aerodynamic solutions that they believed would close the gap to McLaren and Mercedes on a circuit that demanded both high-speed stability and strong tire management. The early signs in practice were encouraging. The car responded. The times were competitive, and going into qualifying, there was a genuine belief inside the garage that this could be a weekend where Ferrari finally showed their true pace. Leclerc delivered in qualifying. He put the car in a position that made the race a real opportunity. And then the race started. For the opening laps, everything looked manageable. Leclerc held his position at the front. Hamilton, meanwhile, was dealing with the consequences of early contact that damaged his car and dropped him back into traffic. For a moment, it looked like Ferrari's race was going to be defined by Leclerc at the front and Hamilton fighting to recover from the back. But Formula One races are dynamic. They breathe, they shift. And as the first stint developed, something became clear. Hamilton was catching up, not just recovering, actually catching up, in a damaged car, matching the pace of drivers who had clean machinery and clear air. Lap after lap, the gap closed. And inside the Ferrari garage, the data was telling a story that should have changed every calculation they had. Hamilton's tire life, Hamilton's pace on the medium compound, Hamilton's ability to push without destroying the rubber. Every number was pointing toward the same conclusion. There was an opportunity forming in real time, and the question was whether Ferrari would see it fast enough to act. This is where modern Formula One becomes something far more complex than a simple race. Because at the highest level, speed is no longer the only variable. Reaction time matters just as much. The ability to read a situation, process the data, make a call, and communicate it to the driver inside a narrow window of opportunity, that's where races are won and lost in 2025. McLaren understood this first. They built their entire operation around decision speed. When a window opens, they move. They don't wait for certainty. They assume risk, act early, and adjust if needed. That philosophy costs them occasionally, but far more often it wins them races before the competition even realizes the window was open. Mercedes operates similarly. Years of accumulated experience under pressure have created a culture inside that pit wall that values decisiveness. They've made mistakes, they've called strategies that didn't work, but they make the call, they don't wait. Ferrari's culture historically has been different, and Miami exposed exactly why that difference matters. Inside the Ferrari garage, as Hamilton closed the gap and the window began to form, the conversation was happening. The engineers were looking at the data, the strategists were running the scenarios. The discussions were taking place at the highest level of the team in real time. But the call didn't come, not immediately, not when it should have. Ferrari was doing what Ferrari often does when the situation becomes genuinely complex. They were waiting for certainty, searching for the scenario where every variable aligned perfectly before making the move, and in Formula One, that search almost always ends the same way. By the time you find the perfect moment is already gone. Hamilton felt it happening. He knew what his tires were doing. He knew what the laps ahead looked like. He understood, with the clarity that only a driver with his experience can access in real time, that every lap behind Leclerc was a lap that made the eventual outcome worse. Not because Leclerc was the problem, but because the race was moving around them. The safety car window, the undercut potential, the tire delta between himself and the cars ahead. Every lap of hesitation was a lap of opportunity disappearing. And then came the message that the entire Formula One world heard. Have a tea break while you're at it. 5 words, delivered with the kind of sarcasm that only arrives after real frustration has been building for a while. Instantly viral, instantly relatable to anyone who has ever watched a Ferrari strategy unfold in slow motion. But the people who laughed at the message missed the actual story. Because that message wasn't born out of a bad moment, it was born out of a complete read of the situation. Hamilton wasn't venting. He was communicating with the precision of a driver who had already processed everything the engineers were still calculating. He saw the window. He saw it closing. He knew what the delay was costing. And the message was his way of saying, in the most unmistakable terms possible, that the moment was being lost in real time. This is what separates Hamilton from almost every other driver on the grid. It's not just speed, it's intelligence, situational awareness at a level that very few people in the history of the sport have ever possessed. The ability to understand not just what is happening inside his own car, but what is happening across the entire race simultaneously. Where the opportunities are, where the risks are, where the timing is critical, and where delay is fatal. Hamilton was reading Miami like an experienced trader reading a market. Every second of hesitation was a second of value evaporating, and he knew it before the engineers had finished their conversation. The pit wall eventually made the call, but by the time they did, several things had already changed. The window that had been building was significantly narrower. The tire advantage that existed a few laps earlier had been partially eroded. The cars ahead had adjusted their own strategies in response to the shifting dynamics of the race. And the Ferrari that could have emerged from a perfectly timed stop into clean air and fresh rubber instead emerged into a more complicated situation. The result that had been theoretically available a few laps earlier was no longer on the table. Ferrari had the pieces, they had the pace, they had the driver who was telling them exactly what needed to happen and exactly when it needed to happen. And they were still too late. Now you might be thinking that this is simply the story of one difficult race, one tough call under pressure, one moment where the data wasn't perfectly clear and the team made a conservative decision that didn't work out. That's a reasonable interpretation, but it's not the full story. And this is where the conversation has to go deeper, because if Miami were an isolated incident, it would be a footnote. a bad weekend, a race to learn from and move on. The problem is that Miami isn't isolated. The pattern exists. Go back through Ferrari's recent history and you will find versions of this story repeated with uncomfortable regularity. Moments where the team had everything they needed to make the decisive move and hesitated. Moments where the data pointed clearly in one direction and the pit wall waited for more information. Moments where the window was open and visible to everyone watching from the outside, but somehow wasn't acted on from the inside. This is not about blaming individuals. That's the wrong conversation. Ferrari employs some of the most talented engineers and strategists in the sport. The people making these calls are not making them carelessly. They are not indifferent to the outcome. But there is something about the culture of decision-making inside that operation that consistently produces the same result under pressure. Hesitation, excessive caution when speed is required, a search for certainty in conditions that don't offer it. And in Formula One, that pattern is more damaging than a slow car, because a slow car can be fixed with engineering. A slow decision-making culture is far harder to address. It lives in the instincts, it lives in the habits. It lives in the way conversations happen inside the garage when the pressure is highest and the stakes are real. After the strategy call was made and the race played out, a second layer of tension became visible. Leclerc's radio communications told their own story. The sarcasm in his responses to the pit wall wasn't subtle. And when both drivers of the same team are simultaneously questioning the strategy from inside their cars during an active race, what you're watching isn't just a difficult afternoon. You're watching a pressure fracture, a moment where the confidence that a team needs to function at the highest level breaks down in real time. That moment, more than any individual strategy call, is what makes Miami significant. Because confidence in your pit wall is not a nice to have, it's fundamental. The relationship between a driver and their engineers in Formula One is built on trust. Trust that when you're pushing the car to the absolute limit, when you're making decisions inside the cockpit at speeds that don't allow for second guessing, the people talking into your ear know exactly what they're doing and have already seen what you're seeing. When that trust fractures, even briefly, the damage ripples through everything that follows. Hamilton has won more world championships than any driver in the history of the sport. He has seen every version of this situation. He knows what a well-functioning operation feels like from the inside. He knows what peak decision-making under pressure sounds like in his earpiece. He also knows when it isn't there. And the question that no one inside Ferrari is asking loudly enough is whether Hamilton's arrival at the team has made the operational gap more visible. Not because he's creating problems, but because his standard of reference is different from anything Ferrari has had access to in a very long time. When you bring in a driver who has spent decades inside teams that commit early, decide fast, and operate with the kind of reflexive confidence that comes from winning under extreme pressure, you also bring in a reference point, a mirror. And what Miami may have shown, in the most uncomfortable way possible, is that what Ferrari sees in that mirror is a gap they didn't fully understand existed. The car is getting faster. The upgrades are working. The raw pace is improving. These are real, measurable things. The engineering progress at Ferrari over the past 12 months has been genuine, and the people doing that work deserve credit for it. But speed without operational precision is incomplete. McLaren didn't win their Constructors' Championship by building the fastest car on every circuit. They won it by building a team that could extract maximum value from what they had every single weekend. By making the call before the window closed. By committing when commitment was required. By trusting their own analysis fast enough to act on it before the opportunity disappeared. That's the model. That's the standard. And that's the gap Ferrari is still chasing, even as the car improves. This is what makes Hamilton's situation genuinely complicated. He came to Ferrari because he believed in the project. He saw a team with real potential, real resources, and a genuine ambition to compete for championships. He wasn't wrong about any of those things. The foundation is real. The belief inside that garage is real. The talent is real. But talent without operational efficiency produces exactly what Miami produced. A car fast enough to fight for the podium. A driver who saw the moment before the engineers acted on it, and a result that reflected neither the car's potential nor the driver's capability. Just the cost of waiting too long. The most telling detail from Miami wasn't the radio message. It was what came after. Ferrari's response to the situation, the adjustments they made inside the race, the communications that followed. All of it suggested a team that was reacting to events rather than shaping them. Adapting to what had already happened rather than anticipating what was about to happen. And at the level where championships are decided, that difference is everything. Because the teams that win are the teams that live 3 laps in the future. They see the window before it opens. They position their driver before the opportunity becomes obvious. They make the call when it feels early, not when it feels safe. Ferrari has shown, repeatedly and in high-pressure moments across multiple seasons, that they are still more comfortable reacting than anticipating. Miami didn't create that problem. Miami just made it impossible to ignore. Here's what's most important to understand going forward. Ferrari's competitive situation in 2025 is genuinely complex. The car has pace, the drivers are performing, the upgrades are real. There is a version of this season where everything comes together and Ferrari fights seriously for championships. But that version requires more than engineering. It requires operational precision at the highest level, decision-making speed that matches the pace of modern Formula One. A culture inside the pit wall that can process pressure and produce decisive action when the window is narrow and the stakes are maximum. Miami showed us that version doesn't exist yet. Not completely, not reliably, and the most uncomfortable part of that truth is that it isn't something you can solve with a new front wing. You can't wind tunnel your way out of a decision-making culture. You can't simulate pressure fast enough to fix hesitation that's been building inside an organization for years. The only solution is to change how the team operates when the race is live and the outcome is uncertain. That's the hardest kind of change there is in motorsport. It requires admitting that the problem isn't the car. It requires looking honestly at the processes and habits that exist inside the operation, and deciding which ones are fast enough for the standard the team claims to be chasing. Ferrari has done it before. Historically, there have been versions of this team that operated with ruthless efficiency, moments in their history where the pit wall was as decisive as any in the sport. The question is whether this version of Ferrari, with Hamilton alongside Leclerc and a car that is genuinely improving, can find that level before the season moves past the point where it matters. Because the races won't wait, the windows will keep opening, the opportunities will keep forming, and every time Ferrari hesitates in a moment that required commitment, the cost compounds. Hamilton knows all of this. He doesn't need to be told. He's lived it. He's won in environments where every millisecond of decision-making mattered. He's been inside operations where the pit wall moved before the window was fully visible. He knows what that feels like from the cockpit, and he knows exactly what it feels like when it doesn't happen. Miami, for all its surface-level drama, for all the viral moments and radio messages and social media reaction, was ultimately a moment of clarity. Not about Ferrari's pace, not about Hamilton's frustration, not even about the specific strategy call that came too late. It was a moment of clarity about what Ferrari's real limit is in 2025. And the honest answer is harder to accept than a slow car, because a slow car has a solution you can build. A hesitating operation has a solution you have to become. and becoming something different, something faster, something more decisive. At this level of competition, with this many variables in play simultaneously, is the most difficult challenge in motorsport. Ferrari knows it. Hamilton knows it. The entire paddock is watching to see whether the people who need to change it know it too. Miami wasn't just a missed podium. It was a warning. One that is going to be very hard to ignore as the season gets longer, the margins get smaller, and the races where Ferrari needs to be perfect start arriving one after another. The car is ready. The question is whether the team is. And that question didn't exist before Miami. Now it does. So here's what this really comes down to. Ferrari's 2025 season is at a crossroads that has nothing to do with aerodynamics or tire compounds or chassis development. It's at a crossroads about identity, about what kind of team Ferrari wants to be when the race is live and the outcome is uncertain, and the only thing separating a podium from a disappointment is the willingness to act before the window closes. Hamilton has made that question impossible to avoid. Not because he demanded anything, not because he criticized publicly, but because his presence and his performance in Miami made visible what was previously easier to explain away. That gap between a team with real potential and a culture that hasn't yet caught up to what that potential requires is the defining story of this Ferrari season. Miami was chapter 1. There are many more chapters coming. And how Ferrari responds to what Miami revealed will determine whether this season becomes memorable or just another year where the car improved, but the results never matched the potential. Hamilton has seen both versions from the inside. He knows which one this is heading toward. The real question is whether Ferrari does too. And if you've been watching this team as long as some of us have, you know that knowing the problem and fixing the problem are two very different things inside Maranello. This conversation is far from over, and the next time a window opens in the middle of a race, the entire paddock is going to be watching the Ferrari pit wall, not to see how fast the car is, to see how fast they decide. What do you think really happened in Miami? Did Ferrari simply make one difficult call under pressure, or did Hamilton just put a spotlight on something inside that team that's been there for a long time? And more importantly, if this pattern continues, what does it mean for Hamilton's future at Ferrari? Does he stay committed to the project, or does Miami mark the beginning of a shift in how he sees what this team is capable of being? Leave your answer in the comments. Every single perspective matters in this conversation. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, because the stories that are forming around Ferrari and Hamilton in 2025 are only getting more complex from here. The best analysis is still ahead. Stay with us.